antisocial behaviour. Diana Johnson to move.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to start by thanking the Backbench Business Committee for this opportunity to debate an issue which affects every constituency all over the United Kingdom. And certainly in the last couple of years, antisocial behaviour has become one of the biggest issues in my constituency. And I think it's absolutely vital that Parliament continues to debate these bread and butter issues at a time when we seem to be solely squeezed on time to discuss Brexit. Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire Service in 2018 found that 40% of respondents nationally think that crime and antisocial behaviour is a problem in their own area, and that's up from 25% in 2015. And of course, antisocial behaviour appears in many forms. Gangs of youths hanging around parades of local shops, convenience stores and off-licences, public drinking, vehicle damage and theft, aggressive begging, drug dealing, noise nuisance, attacks on public transport, and in my own constituency recently, we've had the experience of stones being thrown at buses in the Orchard Park area, meaning that the bus companies have had to divert the buses away from that particular area. And of course we know that antisocial behaviour is also about vandalism, graffiti, fly tipping and rubbish. Now, as a constituency MP, I want to make some observations about what's happening locally in my own patch in Hull North, but I also want to draw out some of the common themes that are developing around the United Kingdom, challenge the Minister about what the government needs to do, and make some suggestions about sharing good practice. So just returning to my home city, Hull is a fantastic city with many good, hard-working people, salt of the earth and proud of their community. Many believe in the best community values of solidarity that we see in friendly societies and trade unions. And I have to say, very sadly, this is typified currently by the community coming together in the search for the missing university student, Libby Squire, by the work the emergency service are doing with the University of Hull and students and local people. And it's also shown in the work with young people by Steve Arnott and his Beats Bus crew, or the work of the boxer Tommy Coyle. But like any city or town, Hull has its problems. And sadly, we now have a generation of young people who've grown up in the austerity years. You could call them the austerity generation, some of them becoming very difficult to reach. Now, on a visit to a local primary school in my constituency, the Year Sixes told me that they didn't feel safe in their local area. They mentioned youths hanging around in the park who were aggressive and intimidating. They told me of drug dealing going on, and they didn't like the rubbish and fly tipping blighting where they live. Nationally, 2.2 million children aged 10 to 17 are worried about crime and antisocial behaviour, and 950,000 children have experienced crime and antisocial behaviour. So when I ask constituents to tell me about their experiences of antisocial behaviour, this is what some of them said. Youths on motorbikes screaming around North Bransholme at all hours, making lots of noise and driving dangerously in and out of cars and other motorists, causing them to brake hard. Or groups of intimidating youths also hanging around shops, being verbally abusive and displaying antisocial behaviour around people trying just to use the shops. Always the same ones. I've stopped going now, it's got beyond a joke. Or one of our neighbours banging on our door for quite a few times with his guests. They were shouting as they were all drunk. I called 999 because I didn't have a credit to call on 101. The operator said this isn't an emergency and disconnected my call by advising me to call on 101. And a few minutes later they urinated inside my house through the door. Or this comment, I have been spat at, threats to slit my fucking throat, threats to smash my fucking face in. Now, feeling safe where you live, work or play is really important to us all, and antisocial behaviour can make people's lives absolutely miserable. And as our local Police and Crime Commissioner Keith Hunter says, and he's also the national lead for the Police and Crime Commissioners on antisocial behaviour, that antisocial behaviour is often the start of what can lead to serious criminal behaviour if it's not checked and dealt with. And it's clear now that we need to reclaim our public spaces for the law-abiding majority. And Keith Hunter has also said that when public services and policing retreat from public spaces, there will always be a section of society who will seek to use that void for their own criminal or antisocial purposes. That hard core encourages others who under different circumstances would not be a problem. And then law-abiding people don't go to those areas, reinforcing the takeover by the bad element. And so I have to reflect on the fact that since 2010, there has been a cut to Humberside police budgets of 31%, and until recently, policing levels in Humberside were down to levels not seen since the 1970s. We've stopped seeing police and special constables or PCSOs on our streets, especially outside the city centre. We've also lost our excellent Hull community wardens that provided an extra reassuring presence on the streets all around Hull. And it's not just police numbers, equipment has been cut too. So for example, we no longer have our own helicopter based at Humberside Airport, which could respond quickly, tracking suspects and identifying cannabis factories with its heat-seeking capability. We now share a helicopter with other Yorkshire forces, and Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary reported in 2017 of the substandard response to ongoing police incidents by the decline in national helicopters. And I'm aware that, of reports that Lincolnshire Police are using police drones, and I wondered if the Minister could reflect upon that as a cost-effective idea that other police forces should consider using more widely. Now, the police settlement this week does not, sadly, produce the central government funding that police forces need. Humberside's Police and Crime Commissioner says services are stretched to breaking point, and he's now having to consult on a 6.4% council tax precept increase. And let's remember, this is a regressive tax. It's on the just managing to raise the money that he needs to stabilise the police numbers and meet increasing costs of the force. But thankfully, we do have a Police and Crime Commissioner who's actively recruiting and training police officers to restore some of the numbers lost since 2010. And he recognises the reassurance of having a presence focused on the front line. Very happy to.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way, and she's making absolutely vital points on the issue of antisocial behaviour. And she mentioned earlier on the role of community support officers and the cuts to community support officers, which is why the Welsh Government stepped in Wales to fund community support officers across Wales when the UK Government cut the funding. Isn't this a stark reminder of the difference between Labour and Tory government's record on police and women government?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for making that intervention. I think that sets out very clearly the difference and how the role of PCSOs are valued in Wales. I do want to say, though, that there are some good initiatives happening in Humberside to tackle antisocial behaviour. And I think particularly when the police work alongside some of our very active Labour councillors, people like Rosie Nicola, Gary Waring, Steve Wilson, Gwen Lunn, Marjorie Brabazon and Anita Harrison, who are all determined to tackle antisocial behaviour in their own areas. So, for example, the use of a mobile cop shop to move to areas when problems develop. And with the current problems with attacks on buses, the plan to use a Trojan bus, which will have police on board who can take action if stones and other items are thrown at the bus. They can stop the bus and get off and deal with it. And also, the police are using in local schools a video to show the effects of antisocial behaviour. A video which I think came from Dundee of an example where a child threw a stone at a driver who then swerved and hit a pram and killed a baby. And I think that that kind of video is useful in educating children and young people about the effects of what they think might be a prank. Now, Humberside have also pioneered Operation Yellowfin to combat crime with motorbikes, which is again a big problem in my area. And this has received national recognition, working, for example, with local petrol stations to stop people who are committing antisocial behaviour on motorbikes and mopeds being able to buy petrol. But we need a routine, long-term police presence to deter and detect antisocial behaviour, not just these special one-off operations when things get really bad. Yes, happy to.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Does she agree with me that the fundamental problem with this issue is that with 21,000 police officers taken out of the system, along with antisocial behaviour, along with PCSOs and others, it is an uphill struggle, and what we need is the government to take very seriously that they need to put in very significant resources if we are to tackle antisocial behaviour, because the police at the moment are facing the challenge of dealing with violent crime, which went up by 19% in the last year. So they're deprioritising, by necessity, antisocial behaviour, which is making people's lives a complete misery and terrorising our constituents.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I couldn't agree more with what she's just said. I also think we need to recognise the work that my honourable friend, the member for Hull West and Hessel, has been doing, identifying the off-rolling of pupils in our schools. Now, the reason why that's important is because with the changes to the education landscape and the academisation of schools, we are seeing numbers of children increase, children not in school but are being home educated. They disappear from the school system, but they often then become part of the antisocial behaviour problem. And I'd be interested to know what the Minister's view on that is, and whether she's willing to speak to her colleagues in the Education Department, and also whether she believes that a proposal for education to be represented on the community safety partnerships might be a way forward of dealing with this particular issue. And I also just want to raise the issue of mental health, because I think mental health is an issue where there is very much more that we need to do to recognise that antisocial behaviour, what it does to people's health and well-being, as well as also recognising that mental health issues can often or sometimes be a reason why perpetrators get involved in antisocial behaviour and the help that they need and require. Now, one idea which could be rolled out nationally, of course, came out of New York in the 1990s when the mayor there took that zero tolerance approach to antisocial behaviour, fly tipping, rubbish and graffiti. And that had really positive outcomes. So if a window was broken, it was fixed, and if rubbish was piled up, it was moved, and people were dealt with if they behaved in an antisocial way. But for that to work, it needs stable funding, and as my honourable friend was just saying from Bethnal Green and Bow, that has to come from central government, and it also needs a multi-agency approach, and I also believe strong political leadership nationally and locally. Now, I understand that there is a plan to do this very thing in my own constituency in Beverley Road, which has multiple issues connected to antisocial behaviour, but sadly it's been much talked about, but not too much progress so far, and communities are still suffering from the blight of antisocial behaviour. One other issue I'd like the Minister to look at is the effect of supported housing for those with drug and alcohol problems, mental health issues, or perhaps just recently having left prison. In Hull, there are many projects housed in Victorian terraced housing in tightly packed neighbourhoods with limited support. I often have complaints of shouting, swearing, drinking, drug taking, threats of violence from these properties. I also have a large hostel, Westbourne House, in a residential area, which along with the Police and Crime Commissioner, we believe it's in the wrong location and causes antisocial behaviour problems to that neighbourhood. Now, establishing such hostels and supported housing in settled communities can cause these real problems, and I hope the Minister will be able to say something about better guidance for where they should be located, better monitoring and enforcement of contracts, and also questions, and I also question whether more powers are needed by the CQC. And alongside all of this, I have to mention that the National Audit Office shows the scale of funding reductions to my city since 2010 has decreased by 37% in government funding to the council. So early intervention schemes have been scaled back and only focused on those most desperately in need when in crisis. And children's centres changed from their original purpose of a universal service to all families, and voluntary and youth groups cut. And along with all these other cuts, we are now creating, or we're now at the point where we've got a perfect storm in our most disadvantaged communities. And often it's such a false economy when cuts to services mean that it will cost taxpayers much more in the longer term. Now, one area of antisocial behaviour I just want to talk about briefly is about neighbour disputes. And often constituents have raised with me that they have to fill in numerous diary sheets and nothing ever happens. And the whole City Council tell me they have to demonstrate a pattern of behaviour, so they need the sheets to prove that. And even then the behaviour may not be serious enough for enforcement action, i.e. eviction. And I'm also told that current pressure on the courts mean that when Hull City Council does go for eviction and has all the evidence to hand, it can take up to 8 months or more for that to happen. And even when they get hearing dates, they're frequently adjourned. But this type of neighbour antisocial behaviour causes real upset and distress, and I wanted to know from the Minister what more she thinks she could do to tackle this. One of my final points is about legislation. And of course, when the coalition government came in 2010, they changed antisocial behaviour legislation, I think led by the Liberal Democrats, who thought that Labour's antisocial behaviour legislation was too draconian and obviously felt they needed to be more on the side of the perpetrators than the victims. So we've seen the introduction of things like the community protection notice. Now that can work quite well, but it can't be issued to under 16s. So your only option then is to use injunctions. And what I'm told by the council is the problem with an injunction is it's very hard to enforce. Hull City Council have to get good evidence and signed affidavits and apply to court and pay fees. So they've got the burden of getting the injunction, but then if it's breached, there's very little that happens. And that also links with my concern about criminal behaviour orders, which are only available once a conviction has been achieved. And I came across recently a young man given a CBO, breached it multiple times, went to court, and no action was taken, yet he was terrorising a local community. I've written to the Justice Minister several times and not had a satisfactory response, so I hope the Minister might be able to help me get that. So I would suggest it's time for a review of the legislation and also a review of the training and understanding of the effects of antisocial behaviour by the judiciary. Now, in conclusion, I just wanted to remind the House, and the House may have heard this story already, but it's a story that my friend, the former Right Honourable Member for Holborn and St Pancras used to tell. So it's Frank Dobson. He used to tell it about Lena Jager, who was campaigning as the Labour candidate in the 1953 by-election, and she canvassed a woman in a block of flats in Camden Town. Lena launched at that time into the great left-wing issue of the day, which was about German rearmament and the threat that it posed to international peace and security. And when Lena paused for breath, the constituent asked, "Did you come up in the lift?" "Yes, dear," replied Lena. "Stinks of piss, doesn't it?" said the woman. "Yes, dear," said Lena. "Can't you stop 'em pissing in the lift?" asked the woman. "I don't think I can," said Lena. "Well," said the woman, "if you can't stop them pissing in our lift, how can you expect me to believe that you can stop the Germans rearming?" So in 2019, if we can't get all our agencies working together to stop youths throwing stones at buses in Orchard Park or tackle aggressive begging in my patch in Newland Avenue, how will voters believe that we can sort out the big challenge facing us around Brexit?